I rise to present ACR 104, which declares Sunday, February 19th, as Day of Remembrance. I'm pleased to be joined by members of the Legislative Asian and Pacific Islander Caucus in bringing forward this resolution. Each of us are privileged to serve California, and as servants of the people, each of us took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California. In doing so, each of us took on a sober and solemn obligation to be active participants in the first of the Constitution's charges, to build a more perfect union. Of necessity, that means that we must remember those moments where our union was less perfect, where the actions of our leaders stood in contrast to our founding principles of liberty and justice. Today, we commemorate one of those moments and reaffirm our solemn obligation to use those lessons of the past to prevent the reoccurrence in the future. 70 years ago, on February 19th, Executive Order 9066 became a wartime law, which led to the incarceration of 120,000 American citizens and legal residents of Japanese ancestry during World War II. This was an action that echoed previous actions in wartime, in particular the actions of Cicero in a time of war when he believed that laws should fall silent. Cicero believed that Cicero's understanding takes on more poignancy given the challenges of our current era, that popular wisdom can be a force for positive change when it's founded from a place of hope, and that wisdom can be equally destructive when it comes from a place of fear. In an era where we have confronted fears stemming from a war, from economic calamity, these lessons take on a special significance. Fear of the other becomes a powerful actor, and when it does, any group that could possibly be seen as not entirely American can become a target of suspicion and hostility. In those days after Pearl Harbor, it was fear that culminated in Executive Order 9066 by President Roosevelt, a decision supported by then California Attorney General Earl Warren. Two men who today are revered for taking critical steps towards building the irreversible momentum for the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s were responsible for a gross injustice on loyal citizens of the United States. This was a bipartisan sin against our Constitution. That is something that we are all clearly understanding today. Every forced relocation, every item of property seized, every vandalized business and home was a crime against justice. In places where Japanese Americans lived, certainly in the three remaining historic Japan towns in San Jose and San Francisco and Little Tokyo in my district, loyal Americans subtly had their loyalties questioned and posters and proclamations commanding them to assemble for internment. These posters were everywhere throughout California, in places like Fruit Ridge Road here in Sacramento, or in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles where my mother grew up. The men and women who saw these signs in LA were told to assemble at the Old Union Church. A place of worship became the house of injustice. For thousands of Japanese Americans, that church became a symbol of fear and injustice, as did the Santa Anita racetrack, where those loyal Americans were forced to sleep in stables as they awaited transportation to places that now haunt our memories, like Tule Lake and Manzanar. Those camps still stand today as desolate reminders of a shameful moment of our past. Millions of loyal American citizens were forced to confront the brutal reality that the United States has its share of moments where our actions conflict with our founding ideals. California is certainly no stranger to those moments. We see examples through our history: our role in the Chinese Exclusion Act, the repeal of the Rumford Fair Housing Ordinance, and certainly most starkly, the internment of Japanese Americans. And that's why we must take these opportunities for us to reflect on the past. It's because we make an active effort to remember our history as we strive towards justice that makes us look back on these events in an earlier California with shock and with disdain and with regret. Despite actions that conflicted with the ideals for which we fought in World War II, thousands of Japanese American young men joined our military, fought with distinction, and contributed to our victory. From their example, we're reminded that the ties that bind us together as a people are resilient and strong. That lesson is strengthened by a former member of this body, Ralph Dills. Alone amongst his colleagues, he spoke out against this injustice. He lost his seat in his next election because he stood on principle. And yet he reclaimed that seat later, not because he recanted his views, but because hope replaced fear in the hearts of Californians, and we recognized the injustice of our previous actions. There are examples of why we can today reaffirm our commitment to those sacred obligations enshrined in the words and the concept to form a more perfect union.